So do you want to start off by just telling me a little bit about what work you do here, your programs and initiatives?
Sure. So I'm the program manager for social justice engagement, and we really work with the co-curricular experience here in the Multicultural Center. So we do a lot of programming that relates to dialogue and getting people to communicate across difference. We also do workshops and trainings. That's the primary work that I do is workshops and trainings. And we also have engagement strategies like the DICE certificate, that's the Diversity Intercultural Community Engagement certificate that students can earn through the center.
Awesome. So going a little bit into sort of the diversity in television, how do you view the, increasing, this is talking about gender, LBGT, racial diversity, just kind of across the board. How do you see that as affecting, students and young people who are kind of like coming to college? Maybe this is the first time that they're interacting with people who are different. Do you see any like parallels to that or any things that students can take away? I know that was like a lot.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Yes, I do. I think, looking back to when I was a kid or even when I went to college, diversity on television was kind of a thing. But it wasn't really dealt with in any meaningful ways. And so I'm thinking about like the 90s, there was like this burst of like multicultural shows where there would be like a kid from almost every racial or ethnic group that you could think of, but there wasn't really like a dealing with race and ethnicity. There definitely were very few and far between LGBT characters on television. And so I've definitely seen an increase in, I think, meaningfully delving into issues of identity on television, and I think that's great. I think there are a lot of students who I'm seeing who are coming to college with knowledge around certain issues because they've seen it on a TV show or because they've seen a movie having to do with something like that. So I think in that way, it has a positive impact on students in that they're exposed to identities and maybe even issues related to identities that they might not have been exposed to before. On the flip side of that, we are still dealing with the issue of media representation of very prominent stereotypes in some television shows and movies. And so I think about people who, for instance, have only ever met or I shouldn't say met, only ever seen a gay person through the lens of maybe Modern Family, right? Which is a show that in theory has a lot of diversity relatively, but really typecasts its characters into certain ways. And so I think in some ways it can be helpful and in some ways it can be harmful, and trying to take the diversity that's on television and in film right now with a grain of salt is really important as well.
Gotcha. So, are there ways that like students can like think critically about the shows that they're viewing and the media that they're like taking in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think things that we have a workshop here from the center and specifically with SJE that's called Media Matters, and that talks about representation in media. And at the end of the workshop, we really try to give people tools to critically analyze the media that they're consuming. So some of the questions that we ask are things like, what do you think about what you're watching? How many times am I Netflix binging and I don't think about what is my actual reaction to what I'm seeing? So thinking about what you're thinking about, I think, can be really helpful. Trying to question whether or not you're generalizing an entire group of people based on what you're seeing can be really, really helpful. I know I'm guilty of doing that, and a lot of people are. It's just the way that our brains work. You see something and you're like, oh, that's the way that it is. And that's not true for everyone. So really trying to treat individual stories as just that. That's the way that that individual is experiencing something, and that may or may not be adaptable to other people within that group can be really helpful. And another useful question that we pose is asking yourself the question, who's missing from this? That's something that I really like to ask when I'm consuming media, is who's missing, which I think brings up a lot of the things that are happening, with the Oscars right now and other award shows.
Gotcha. And I mean, do you think that there, are a lot of things missing from entertainment and television right now? I mean, even though if we are like moving in the right direction, like,
yeah,
what kind of things do you think,
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many things missing. And I think that's just the nature of the way that Hollywood in particular works. But, even as we're making progress in some areas, we're still so woefully behind in other areas. I think about oftentimes the representation of Native Americans or American Indigenous people on television. I rarely, if ever, see folks represented from that identity group, except for maybe perhaps the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, which has its own issues and has some controversy around that. So I think we're seeing more and more of this. So I think about Fresh Off the Boat, which is an ABC show, maybe Master of None, which is Aziz Ansari's show on Netflix, but representation of Asian and Asian American characters, slowly increasing, but still not the best. So those are some issues. And I think meaningfully dealing with race and ethnicity without making it like the end all be all. So I think Master of None is a really great example of how you can talk about race in meaningful ways on shows without making it the only storyline. They talk about race in casual conversation, and it's not awkward and it's not weird. And there was a particular episode where they talk about media representation in that show too, and they did it in a way that was funny and it was clever and it made people think, but it wasn't like a caricature of what they were trying to talk about. So I think those are some things that are missing, but or specific identity groups that are missing. But again, I do think that we're making progress.
Awesome. Okay. So is there anything that you think, students can do that, I mean, it is like a big problem and it's very far removed from here, but like even just with interacting with each other or like once they go out into the world to like affect, the media and entertainment and like what is like being produced?
Yeah, I think there are lots of things that can be done. I think if they're, I encounter a lot of students who are not okay with some of the things that they're seeing on TV or on certain media, and I think doing things like boycotting shows or contacting advertisers who put on commercials during those shows can be very, very impactful, and we've seen in a couple of instances that really works. And so those are things I think. As far as, the positive side, if you find a show that is really diverse and is really great at representation, keep watching it, making sure that, those ratings are going up. I think in addition, talking to other people, having meaningful conversations. I think a lot of times people shy away from having what can be difficult or awkward conversations just because we've never had them before. We're not socialized to talk about these things, and it can be a lot easier instead of being like, hey, what do you think about police brutality, right? And instead saying, hey, did you see, Beyonce's new video? Like, what do you think about that? Because I'm still struggling with what I think or how I feel about it, right? I think having that conversation might be a lot easier and maybe slightly less scary than having the police brutality conversation. But those two things, you're essentially talking about very similar ideas. So I think, continuously conversing about what we're seeing in the media too, because so often we just mindlessly consume it.
Sorry. Okay.
No, you're okay.
All right. Well, I mean, that's pretty much all of the questions I had about that. Okay. I mean, like I said, it was going to be brief. But if you do have anything else that you want to say, I mean, about, diversity, multicultural center, diversity in television, you can go ahead and...
Not anything. Well, I guess the one thing I will say is, here at the MCC, we really try to get people to engage in those challenging conversations, and the film series that you talked about earlier, Indie Lens Pop-Up, is one of the ways we do that. So I'll just put a shameless plug out there for that. We watch really awesome documentaries and not like boring things, and talk about the ways in which those documentaries are applicable to our lives here at Ohio State, what they mean for larger issues. And there's some really cool concepts we're doing. Later this season, we have one on a female boxer who's about to compete in the Olympics. We just did one on the Black Panther Party, and previous to that, we did one on the Polynesian pipeline to the NFL. So it's just lots of different topics and lots of really cool issues, and I think, again, consuming media is one of those ways that we can engage in having those difficult conversations, and it can be really helpful. So that's just a shameless plug for that program.
Awesome. I wish